If you will, go ahead and turn to the book of Numbers, the Old Testament book of Numbers, chapter 21. While you're turning there, let me say I was thinking about an aspect of this sermon, and I was looking at Noah as he led singing and John for the Lord's Supper. Let me say thank you so much for all of the men that help lead in all of the different aspects, whether it's leading singing or prayer, helping lead the Lord's Supper, or whatever it is that you do, whether it's mowing the yard or whatever, staying and cleaning on Wednesdays. All of those things are extremely encouraging and also necessary. But let me also thank all of the ladies for all of the different things that you do also around the congregation. I'm going to look at a topic this evening, probably a topic maybe that many of you have not looked at. It's not a topic that I have spoken on very often. We're going to look at the bronze serpent in Numbers chapter 21. And again, it's a topic that many people have not even heard of. And you may look at this chapter and say, well, what does this really even have to do with New Testament Christianity? But I assure you, Jesus himself refers back to this chapter. And so it'll all come together at the end here. Numbers 21, if you will, follow along with me. I'm going to read from verses 4 through 9. Numbers 21, 4 through 9. And they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. And the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. And the people spake against God and against Moses, Wherefore have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. And therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Now you may look at that account and say, what in the world does that have to do with New Testament Christianity, and why do I need to even be familiar with this account? Well, let me try to give you a little bit of background first on the account. What we know has occurred, and I would encourage you to go back and look at this account in detail. Read the chapters before and after. Aaron has just died on Mount Hor, Numbers 20, verses 22 through 29. And Israel has just defeated the king of Arad. He dwelt there in the southern part of Canaan. You'll find that in Numbers 21, verses 1 through 3. And so Israel now, they are traveling around the area of Edom. And you may recall, we talked about the nation of Edom, the Edomites, and why Israel and the Edomites didn't get along very well. Edom oftentimes was abusive to Israel. They oftentimes would go out of their way, it seems, to cause Israel problems, and Edom had refused to allow Israel to pass through their land. And so Israel was having to go around, and we learned that they're in this area called the Arabah. It was a very hard country, and so instead of being able to pass through in an easy area to travel, they were having to pass through an area that was very hard for them to circumnavigate. And as they traveled around the land, they began to become very discouraged. They began to complain about all of the situations that were taking place in their life, but they didn't just leave it there. They didn't just complain about, the hardship of where they were traveling or so forth. They then began to complain about the one that God had placed in charge of them to lead them. And they didn't just stop with Moses. They also then began to complain about God. Okay? And some people would say, well, I can't really see how the Israelites would do that. We've talked numerous times about the Israelites and the problems they had with their contentment. Here they are in a situation where they're not content. They're not content with the current situation. They're not content with their leader. They're not content with God. And so one of the things we need to understand as followers of God, we need to be content with all that we have. Now we know that the Israelites were not. And I want you to listen to Numbers 21, verse 5. And the people spake against God and against Moses, Now listen to what they said. Wherefore have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Now, if he hadn't done that, where else would they have died? There in Egypt, right? But I guess they'd have been able to die in peace. They go on and they said, "For there's no bread, neither is there any water." Now listen to this. "And our soul loatheth this light bread." The manna. They're complaining about the food that God's given them here. And so God punishes them because of their complaints, specifically against Moses and against him. And I began to think a little bit about this. Here they are complaining against God's chosen leader. And I began to think, do we have any other examples of this in the New Testament? Do you recall when somebody came and challenged the authority of Peter, Ananias, and Sapphira and thought that they would lie to him? Acts 5, verses 1 through 11. Do you remember what happened to them? They both died right then and there. And if you go back, it actually says, "And fear came upon the church." So here you have these people now complaining against God and against Moses, and because of what he's blessed them with, and we saw the result of the serpents. You think fear didn't come upon those Israelites because of what they had done? You go back, and again, we've talked about this. This isn't new, the complaining of Israel. They complained on numerous occasions. Let me give them to you, just a few of them again. They complained in Exodus 15 about a lack of water. 2 chapters later, they're still complaining in chapter 17 about water. They complain about the presence of God in Exodus 20. In the book of Numbers, in chapter 11, they complain about having a lack of food, so God sends them manna. Here they're complaining actually about the manna that he sent to them because of their complaint of not having enough food. Numbers 13, they refused to enter Canaan because they were afraid of the people, and so they complain about the people. Here in Numbers 21 through 13, they're again complaining about a lack of water and a whole host of other things. It seems to be a consistent pattern with these Israelites. But this time I want you to understand their complaints were just a little bit different, because this time in their complaint to God, they actually, as I just mentioned, they say, you know what, our soul, it just loathes this white bread that you've sent us, this worthless bread, okay? They weren't happy with the provision that God had given them. Now, you might find it hard to believe that somebody who was being provided by God would be unhappy with the food that he had provided for them. In this case, we're talking about physical food. But how many people today complain about the spiritual food? And you may say, well, what are you talking about? And I began to think a little bit about Jesus. And in answering the tempter in the wilderness, you might recall, he said, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God." And you got people today who will complain about the preaching. They'll complain about the worship. They'll complain about having to study their Bible. They'll find all kinds of things to complain about. You see that certainly with the Israelites here. They weren't happy with the leader given to them. They weren't happy with the provisions God had given to them. And the list goes on and on and on. So what am I saying? Well, there's a lot of things we can learn from the Israelites as we look at this account. Certainly that we ought to be content in life, but another thing is that certainly we need to be concerned about God's Word, about how God has told us to live. If they were concerned about how God had told them to live in more than just looking at the here and now, they wouldn't have focused so much on what they thought that they didn't have at the time. And so we know that certainly they had lost a little bit of their focus. Moses, in speaking to Israel, because they're complaining about this bread that they don't like, and the thing is they forgot about all the other blessings. Listen to what Moses tells them in Deuteronomy 8:4. "Thy raiment waxed not old upon thee, neither did thy foot swell these 40 years. Here's his point. You guys notice you've been walking around for 40 years with the same clothes on and the same shoes, and they're still intact? Have you thought about that? You think God's not providing for you? You complain and you complain and you complain, and yet you don't see all the blessings in front of you that God's given to you. Okay? Your shoes aren't wearing out. Notice in Deuteronomy 29:5, "And I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes are not waxen old upon you, and your shoe is not waxen old upon thy feet." It seems like for whatever reason, Israel continues to forget all the good that God has done for them and all of the blessings, and they seem to focus on whenever there's an obstacle placed in front of them. And if we go back and we look, even though oftentimes obstacles were placed in front of them, time and time again, they were always told how to overcome these obstacles. It always came down to a faithfulness to God. And so very simply we see as we start looking at this account here, certainly they were taking God's blessings for granted. But I want you to ask yourself, do we ever do that? Many of the things we look at as things that we expect we should have, those are blessings. The clothes that we have, most nations, they don't have near what we have. Many of them, I've gone and looked, they don't have clothes. Very little clothes are falling off of them, kind of like their clothes should have been after 40 years. Many of them don't have food on a daily basis. In other parts of the world, we have so much that we literally can't eat it all, and we scrape it into the trash when we're done, right? Most of us have cars, we have houses, the list would go on and on and on. And oftentimes we look at these as things that we just deserve. We overlook the fact that we've been blessed so much. Think about your health. If you're here and you're healthy, you ought to be blessed and consider yourself blessed, because many are not. You begin to look at all these different areas. And so we have to remember what it is that God's given to us and blessed us with, and we should be thankful for it. He's given us everything that we need in this life. Now, more importantly, He's given us everything that we need in this life after. But listen, in this life, what we're told, Philippians 4, 11 and 12, because Paul has this figured out. He says, "Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound everywhere and in all things. And I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need." Paul had learned to be content, really in whatever situation it was that he was in. There were times when Paul probably had plenty of food, more than he could eat. There were other times where he struggled and he went without. We know that he had physical hardships, and yet he says, I've learned that I can be content in whatever situation I'm in. These Israelites, they don't seem to have this figured out. Listen to 1 Timothy 6 through 8. "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content." I'm going to tell you, most of us, we work very hard. Some of us actually work at the expense of our faith and our family. And here's the point. We've mentioned it before. When we die, we're going to leave every bit of that to somebody else. We can't take it with us. The perspective is who we leave behind, not what we leave behind. Listen to Hebrews 13:5, another verse. He says, "Let your conversation or your manner of life be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. For He has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee." Here's the point. We ought to be, again, content. Something the Israelites were struggling with, something that certainly there are people in this world who struggle with. And I began to think about it, and I don't even know who said it. There was a gentleman who told his son, you really ought to never look into another man's bowl unless you're checking to make sure he's got enough. I think that's exactly right. We get caught up, and somebody mentioned it, I think John mentioned it, we get caught up in looking at what other people have. We get caught up in looking at what they have and what we don't have. And what that father had told his son was in essence this: don't look at what other people have unless you're checking to make sure that they have enough. That's the right focus. The Israelites here, they're focused in on themselves, and they don't realize what it is that God has blessed them with. Now I want you to understand, as we look at this account, God was extremely angry with them because of the fact that they began to complain against Moses. They began to complain against God Himself. And just as God had given Israel manna, we're talking about this bread from heaven to sustain them, He gives us everything that we need in life. Most importantly, He gives us what we need for eternal life after we leave this life, right? He's given us His written word. That's what we ought to be focused on. But certainly we're blessed physically. Now, with all that being said, you may say, what does all this have to do? Well, the Israelites didn't understand what it was that God had provided with them. There are many today who don't understand what God had provided to us. I'm talking about His Son. We know that He gave us His Son. Listen to John 3:16. It's a verse that most of you know. "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that here in a few minutes. And you may say, how can you go from the Israelites in this account with them complaining against God, Moses having to intercede because of snakes, how do you then take that to our necessity of Jesus Christ? Well, when all of this began to take place, and they're complaining, and we'll look at it here, they needed somebody to make an intercession for them. Okay? They complained against God, they complained against Moses, and God sent these serpents, these fiery snakes with deadly poison. And they realized real quick they were in a very dangerous situation. They realized what they had done. And so now they need somebody to make intercession for them. Listen to Numbers 21, 6 through 7. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. This is because they were complaining against Moses and God. And they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Therefore the people came to Moses. Notice they're coming to the guy they were just complaining about. And therefore the people came to Moses and said, We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against thee. Pray unto the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. And notice, and Moses prayed for the people. So, the very person they were complaining about, they now come back to and say, please intercede for us. We've sinned and we need someone to go and speak on our behalf. Moses was the intercessor for the people. Even though they'd complained against Moses and against God, he's now the one that they come to and beg. Please go and intercede on our behalf. You ever known somebody who really showed no reverence to God whatsoever until things got so bad in their life that they really had nowhere else to go? And oftentimes, the people they come back to ask for help are the very people that they hurt in times past, okay? The people that they'd stepped on when they were trying to get to wherever it is that they were going. In essence, that's kind of what you've got going on here. They've been bickering and complaining against Moses, and now they've got to come back to Moses because things have gotten so bad they need someone to intercede. This isn't the first time Moses has had to intercede for the Israelites. There were a number of times that Moses had to go because of the things that Israel had done and then ask God to forgive them and in essence not to even get rid of them. You'll recall that the people wanted Moses to intercede for them when God had appeared to Israel at Mount Sinai. Let me read to you from Exodus 20, verse 18 and 19. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak thou with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. We want you to intercede on our behalf. I mean, they were scared to death. We know in Exodus 32, Moses had to intercede for the people when they went out and they took all the items and melted it down, the gold. You remember what they made, right? They made this calf and they began to worship an idol, right? And Moses basically comes down and sees what they've done and says, What have you done? And they said, Can you please intercede for us? And again, Moses has to intercede for them. Numbers 14, Moses had to intercede for the people when they refused to enter into Canaan. And God literally wanted to destroy them. Again, Moses had to go and intercede for them. You may say, well, what again does this have to do with the New Testament? The Israelites, time and time and time again, needed somebody to intercede on their behalf. And certainly today, man needs an intercessor. The person that we would call our intercessor today certainly is not Moses, but instead it would be Jesus Christ. He is our mediator. He's the only mediator. He is the only way to the Father, and it's through His blood. Listen to 1 Timothy 2, verses 5 and 6. For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man, Christ Jesus, who gave Himself a ransom for all to be testified in due time. Now listen to Hebrews 9:15. And for this cause He is the mediator of the New Testament, talking about the testament that we live under. We're not under the old law. That by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, the Old Testament, the law of Moses, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. Okay? I want you to notice something. When Moses went and he interceded on their behalf, I want you to notice what God didn't do. Okay? God didn't take away the serpents. He didn't. But He gave them a way to deal with the serpents. And that's something that's important for us, okay? We understand these serpents, they had a deadly poison. So they go to Moses and they say, please intercede on our behalf. And God doesn't take it away. Now, a lot of people today, they'll pray prayers like that. God, please do this for me. God, please do that for me. And when it's not done, they become upset. God here gives them a way to deal with it. The New Testament gives us as Christians a way to deal with the problems that we have. These serpents that they're facing, they have deadly poison. Listen to Numbers 21, verse 6. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. So now that they've complained against God and Moses, God's wrath is being demonstrated in these serpents which are biting them. They come and they ask Moses to intercede for them. We need to understand, because their problem right then at the time was the fact that these serpents were coming in and giving them a present danger. We need to understand that today there are many dangers out there for us as Christians. They're coming into our homes. They're coming into the church. And so we likewise have to be on the lookout, because they are all full of deadly poison, just like these serpents that the Israelites are dealing with. Certainly in the church and also in our homes, we have got to guard against this father of lies. God, again, He doesn't take away the serpents. He gives them a way to deal with the problem at hand. And you'll see that in Numbers 21, verses 8 and 9. And the Lord said unto Moses, Make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole. And it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and he put it upon a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Okay? So God says, okay, people are being bit by these. Here's the remedy to the situation. I want you to make this serpent. I want you to place it up high on a pole. And when those who have been bitten, or those who have been inflicted, they can come and they can gaze upon this, which is up on this pole, raised up, and they will be healed. Okay? You may say, well, what in the world still does this have to do with the New Testament? I know we're getting there. The cause of the serpents, the fact that they were even there causing the problem, was because they constantly were complaining against Moses and against God, and because of their unbelief. Now again, God sent these serpents to punish the people. And then when the people began to complain, God doesn't remove the problem, but what God does is He gives them a solution to the problem. Let me pause for just a second. The problem today in the world is sin. All men have sinned and come short of the glory of God, right? Romans 3:23, and the consequence is death. And we can complain to God about the fact that we have to deal with sin on a regular basis, and God understands it, but God will not remove the problem. He will, however, give us a way to deal with it. And Jesus talks a little bit about that, okay? God is not going to take sin out of the world. God did not remove those serpents from the presence of the Israelites. But just as that brazen serpent was put up on a pole, Numbers 21:8, we know that Christ was hung up on a tree. John 3:14 and 15. What's the point of my lesson? He wants us to choose to follow Him, but I want you to notice the type and the antitype. And I want you to listen to Jesus' words here as He goes right back to this account with the serpent up on the pole. And at that point, you ought to be able to draw an understanding of what Christ is trying to get us to understand. John 3:14 through 17. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, why? Because they had been inflicted, right? And they needed some way to be healed. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Why? Man is inflicted with a problem today and yet needs a solution. God didn't remove those serpents. God's not going to remove sin. God will, however, give a solution to the problem. Verse 15, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. He gave us His Son, Jesus, who we know died upon that cross, lifted up high. Jesus is the solution to the sin problem. Those who had to deal with those serpents at the time, the Israelites, they had to look up at that brazen serpent on the pole. That was the solution for their problem at hand. Now again, as we look here at Jesus' words and we understand that we have to believe, let me say, because There may be somebody watching this who doesn't watch our sermons on a regular basis, but the idea of believing doesn't simply mean that I have a mental assent or an understanding of the fact that Jesus is the Christ. It goes so much more than that. The word means that not only do I understand, but I'm also willing to do. And if you go back and you look at the account here with the Israelites, that was the problem oftentimes. It wasn't that they didn't know what God wanted them to do. The problem was that they weren't willing to do it. And so inherent in that word believe is the knowledge and also the action. You go back and you look at the Bible, and there are many shadows, types and shadows for us to look at. Hebrews 10:1 says, "For the law having a shadow of good things to come." There are many events in the Old Testament that as we read them, and for many people who, if they were to read this account but not read the New Testament, they would never see a correlation here between the serpent being raised up on the pole and Jesus being raised up on the pole, both of them being the remedy to the solution, or the problem at hand, I mean. And so we look at many of these accounts, and in particular we have these shadows of Christ in the church. In this lesson, we notice that the brazen serpent is a type of Christ. There was only one serpent of brass. I'm going to tell you what, when God told Moses to construct this serpent and to put it on a pole, and that if anybody came and looked at it, they would be healed, somebody else besides Moses couldn't just go and fashion and make their own and then say, no, don't go to the one that Moses made, come to the one that I made and it will work. Because that's not what God had expected. There was no alternative that you could go to. Okay, it was God's way, and God's way was the only way to be healed because of these bites. You now begin to think about sin. Just as there was only one serpent of brass that you could go and look at and be healed, there is only one Messiah, only one Christ that was hung on a cross who can solve the problem of sin today. We know him as Jesus, the Messiah. He was prophesied. We understand that without the shedding of his blood, no man gets to go to heaven. Why do I have to say that? Because you have people who teach a number of things today about what happens when people die. You've got people that say we all go to the same place, but we take different paths. You have some that say when we die, we don't go anywhere. We just get buried in the ground and it's over. What we understand in looking at the Scriptures is just as there was that one brazen serpent who could deal with the problem at hand there for the Israelites, there was only one Messiah who could shed his blood so that each man has the ability to be in heaven. What we need to understand as we look at this, and I won't spend any more time on it, I want you to learn a little bit from the Israelites. I know we've talked about them a lot as of recently. They had a serious problem with contentment. That was their first problem. You notice that the fact that they weren't content caused them to sin. The second thing was, after they realized they had sinned, they then needed an intercessor. They're not any different than man today. Okay? They had a problem. Their desire caused them to sin. That caused further problems in their life, and they needed an intercessor. Man today has many problems and desires. Oftentimes those cause him to sin. And when that happens and he does sin, he therefore needs the intercessor. There's so much we can learn from the Old Testament accounts. And so as I draw this to a close, I guess my main concern is this. I want to look at the parallel between what they allowed their wants and desires and complaints to lead them into. And ask yourself as a follower of God, because they were, am I doing what they do? Am I complaining about the things that I have in my life, or am I grateful and thankful for all of the things I've been blessed with? 2, just as they needed an intercessor when they had a problem, do we also understand the need for the intercessor due to sin in our life? And finally, as followers of God, we need to ask ourselves, am I living the way that God would have me to live? Certainly, I'm sure there were Israelites there who were trying their hardest to live according to God's law, and yet we understand that because of the actions of some, they, as a group, had to deal with the consequences. If you're here today, ask yourself, am I living the way that God would have me to live? And if you're not, deal with it before we leave. One final thing before we leave, if you're here and you're not a baptized believer, let me tell you very quickly what the Bible says about how to be added to the church. The Bible is very clear in all the conversion accounts in the book of Acts that the gospel was taught, The people who heard and received the gospel believed that Jesus Christ was the prophesied Messiah, whom they knew needed to come and shed His blood so that the remission of sins could be granted. They were also taught at the time that they needed to repent of their sins, confess the name of Christ, and be baptized by immersion for the remission of sins, and then live faithfully. If you've not done those, you've not yet been added to the church, because the Lord adds to the church, Acts 2:47, when you've done those things. If you've not done that, please don't leave here without contacting me. If you're watching this online, there's a phone number on our website, and you can call us, and I gladly would point you in a direction I would teach you, or point you in a congregation nearby. Our desire is that each of us as Christians would be faithful, and that each person who's heard the gospel would be obedient to it. If you're here and there's a way that we can help you, you can simply come forward as we stand and sing a song of invitation.
I'm satisfied.